So the most precious issue today in the world, and especially for our countries, Ukraine and Georgia, is the Russian aggression toward Ukraine. Georgia went through that and experienced that firsthand. What kind of lesson Georgia learned from that experience, and what should Ukraine be aware of today?
Well, it's a very good question. What lesson did all of us learn in 2008 when Russian regular army has marched into independent and sovereign Georgian soil and has occupied 20% of our territory, has made hundreds of thousands of Georgian citizens refugees in their own country, that has changed the status of a sovereign country and created two quasi-independent states on our territory. That was 2008 August. What did we all learn, or what did we all do from 2008 till 2014 when the same scenario was rolling in Ukraine? I don't think that we did our homework, neither of us. What happened in Georgian case was that the aggression was stopped, and we are really thankful to European leaders, to Western leaders, that Russian airplanes were stopped and they were not bombarding Tbilisi, and Russian tanks stopped, and the occupation was stalled. But during these 6 years, the issue of Georgia, the issue of a sovereign, peaceful neighboring country to a super nuclear power, was forgotten. And for the 6 years, when another crisis happened in the Russian neighborhood, Russians were the first to act, first to be decisive, first to get in action and play basically the same scenario that was played in Georgia. And were all of us more prepared? In theory, we had this experience. We should be more prepared in 2014 than we were in 2008. But it turned out that the Russians were the only ones that learned the lessons, that has drawn conclusions, and that has put conclusions into actions, and have acknowledged their competitive advantage in this situation, which was active, fast military operation.
Why do you think West didn't really react and didn't prepare for that?
I prefer to say what we should have been doing. And that is, we all should have a response to Russian foreign policy towards its neighborhood. Russia states very clearly and firmly that all of its neighborhood is its backyard, that Russia has the right of privileged interests with its neighbors. That means that though we all are now today in UN and we all celebrate 70th anniversary, we all agree that it is great to have some kind of international law and international order, but all of those principles and laws are shifted and gravitated in Russian neighborhood. What they state very openly is that those international relations, they might be active somewhere else. They might be active in Russian-German or Russian-French or Russian-Brazilian or Russian-US relationships. But when it comes to Russia's neighborhood, those laws are shifted and they are sort of evaporated. And there is a harsh reality of Russian military presence in its neighborhood. This is the theory, and there is no real response to this theory. There is no consolidated no and unacceptance without any discussion to violence. That's what we had to achieve, and that's what we have to achieve. We had to achieve this unanimous acceptance of violence with its neighbors. It is easy, but it turned to be complicated. We didn't achieve that unanimous attitude in 2008. We have to achieve it after Ukraine.
But today, Russia moved to Syria, actually. They moved to Middle East. Do you think Putin is fighting Ukrainians in Ukraine and Georgians in Georgia, or he's fighting West and United States in Ukraine, in Georgia, and now in Syria?
It is difficult to me to think, to sort of predict what other leaders or other politicians think. I see the facts, and the fact is occupied Georgia, the fact is occupied Ukraine, the fact is complications in Moldova, the fact is that countries that make their own independent choice find problems with Russian Federation. And let me note here that neither of these countries had or has any kind of confrontation towards Russia or Russians. The only thing that each of us wants and demands is something that we are entitled to: our sovereignty, our independence, our right to choose our own destiny. So this is the reality we are living in. It is difficult to explain why this is happening, but the fact that this is wrong is there.
How far do you think Putin is ready to go in his neighborhood?
I hope that Russia will go back to rational relationships with its neighbors. I don't know how far this process could go, but I know it has to be drawn to a normal, rational political dialogue. Russia has to sit down at table with Ukrainians, with Georgians, with Moldovan, with Azerbaijan, with Armenia, with all of its neighbors, with Belarus, and discuss peaceful, friendly cooperation, collaboration, all the projects that we can develop together. And the main starting point for these discussions should be respect of these nations, their territorial integrity and their sovereignty. And this is good for Russia, this is good for its development, this is good for overcoming the problems that Russia has and building a more prosperous and peaceful community.
It's definitely good for Russia, but it doesn't look like Putin is ready to commit to that. Do you think that it's possible to have rational relationship with Russia when Putin is in charge of the country?
We had and we will have rational relationships with Russia. We will be targeting to that. We are people who know each other, who respect each other, who respect each other's cultures, who admire personal and cultural relationships, who have great opportunities in trade, in tourism, in building joint projects. So I believe that that is the point that we will come to. And the faster political leaders start thinking and acting in interest of their people, the faster the solutions will come. Neither of the problems that we are discussing has brought any kind of solution of Russian problems to Russian citizens. The bread and butter on Russian citizens' table did not appear when Tkhinvali was occupied. A better future did not appear in, I don't know, any Russian city when Crimea was occupied. A better future did not appear there when Abkhazia was occupied. Russian problems for demographics, for reforming the economy, for reforming the government, they are not solved in occupying Ukraine or Georgia or creating problems in Moldova. I argue that even they are furthered in those cases. So if Russians start talking in context of Russian interests, in context of citizens living, I don't know, in Tomsk or other, in Khabarovsk or in other Russian city, in interest of these people, then I believe we have great solutions for all the problems that we are facing right now.
Let's talk about the interest of Georgia and Ukraine now. Georgia and Ukraine inspired to be closer to Europe, to integrate with Europe. Do you think, let's say, start with Georgia, do you think Georgia is ready to join NATO, and is NATO ready to accept Georgia, and how close we are to that goal?
Georgia is definitely ready to join NATO, and not only politically, but in many instances. Georgia's democracy is furthering, it is deepening and broadening, and we are building and strengthening our democratic institutions. Georgia's army is right now considered one of the most compatible armies of non-NATO forces around the world, together with 5 other countries. Georgians have taken responsibility for international peace and security and paid their lives in Afghanistan and other places. So Georgians are really ready, and they deserve to be to share the security umbrella to which they have committed their men and women in uniform. Now, is NATO ready? NATO is in a conservative phase of its development. The Ukrainian crisis, I believe it has shocked NATO, and NATO is still digesting and rethinking and re-evaluating its attitude towards Russia and towards the security environment. And this is naturally causing a more conservative period in NATO's development. I believe that this period will be overcome, and the clear and security improvement decisions we are going to hear about a more clear and security-oriented decisions which will increase stability and security in the region.
Do you think NATO is the answer to all our security problems, Georgia and Ukraine?
NATO has been the most trustworthy and reliable security umbrella that we know still now. I think it's a shame that after 1994, when Ukraine disarmed its military arsenal, that on the 20th, and it was sponsored and supported by UK, US, and Russia, on the 20th years of the anniversary, we get the environment when one of the sponsors and guarantors of this disarmament, where it was specifically indicated that Ukraine will be maintained, it will be supported in its territorial sovereignty and independence guarantees. We have one of the signatories occupying Ukraine. And believe me, this was the case when Russia and UK and the US should not occupy, but they should defend Ukraine from any theoretical occupation, just as a response to Ukraine's goodwill to disarm. And on the 20th year anniversary, we see Ukraine occupation of Ukraine. So you look at the other guarantees and you see that NATO is only real and workable solution for security. And that's why we are targeting ourselves into this direction.
There was a discussion after the Soviet Union, all this discussion about maybe our countries should somehow create their own security defense mechanism, like Georgia, Ukraine, Baltic states. It didn't happen. Why do you think we were not able, as a small countries, we're not able to join together and do that job partially for ourselves?
Well, it's different to speculate, but I guess we have all opportunity and the center of gravity within the NATO, and it's natural to be willing to join NATO, which is a community, democratic community, a family of nations that we are targeting ourselves anyway. I mean, NATO is not only a security umbrella, it's also an opportunity to develop your society in the same formats and values as the countries in NATO, which coincides mainly with European family of nations. So it was logical to target our political as well as military and security development into this direction.
Now about Europe, do you think Europe is ready to accept few new states? They have their own crisis inside of Europe, and they couldn't get solutions inside. What should Ukraine and Georgia do?
Well, I think that in context of Ukrainian and Georgian integration into EU, those crises that you have mentioned, they are very small scale, historical timeline, exactly. So the crisis will be overcome. The crisis comes and goes, but the European Union is now still the biggest market and the wealthiest society, and the biggest congregation of nations that is operating based on its own values and principles. There are complicated times in Europe, yes, but this will be overcome. But Georgia and Ukraine has targeted itself to this family of nations, and no matter that there might be skeptical times, both of us will be waiting for the window of opportunity, and we'll be doing our homework till that moment.
Talking about that homework, Georgia went through reform itself, making reforms. Now, what about Ukraine? How do you, like, overall, what do you think Ukrainians are doing right, what they're not doing right? Taking your experience.
Well, I think that Ukraine is taking a hard effort to reform, to conduct lots of reforms in a very complicated situation during the war with Russia. But you have no option. That's what you have to do. And plus, with the ceasefire during the war, the hard times are going to be overcome, and the reforms have to be done, and the social issues have to be responded, because no matter that there will be no fire between Russians and Ukrainians, you are in a state of war, and the state of war will be moved into the social formats and social context, and there you have to be as committed and as heroical as Ukrainians were on the battlefields and on the battlegrounds. This war has to be won not only with the cannons, but also with reforms that you have to conduct. And we are supporting Ukraine in its fight for its statehood and independence. And I urge everyone to support Ukraine also in its fight for reforms, which is the part of the same story.
You have frequent conversations with President Poroshenko, and you're building some strategies together. How do you see Ukrainian-Georgian relations today and in the future?
We enjoyed great relationships traditionally. Even during Soviet times, Ukrainians and Georgians would find many similarities in the Soviet system. The way that we appreciated our freedom, the way we identified ourselves as different from Homo Sovieticus, and many other details that we had in common. But unfortunately, the problems that we had after independence have made us even closer to each other. I'm not happy with 2008, I'm not happy with 2014, but now we have even more similarities. We have suffered the same aggression, we had suffered the same unfairness, and that made our nations even closer. So I believe me and President and all of us involved in politics have to serve the basic demands from the citizens. And this demand in Georgia and this demand in Ukraine is the same. Georgians and Ukrainians should stand hand in hand and go together through this hardship and win and conquer their independence in this hard environment.
And one question about you personally. What is your personal goal when you will finish your term as a president? How would you like to see Georgia, and how would you like to see our region as a whole?
I want to see Georgia united. I want to see Georgia peaceful. I want to see Georgia protected, and I want to see Georgia opening all great possibilities of cooperation and partnership that we have in the region.
What about the region generally?
Well, the region is...
And how do you foresee the situation in the region in, let's say, 5 years from now?
It's a difficult task to make predictions. I can tell you about the actions that we have to take. We have to be coordinated. We have to fight together for our independence and independent choice. And one of the main things is that we have no right to get used to unfairness towards us and our nations and our people. So we have to stand hand in hand and not get used to this occupation and aggression, and we have to make our allies active and engaged in solving those issues. That's what we have to do in a coordinated format, and I believe we'll achieve the result.
So you think that our voices should be louder on international arena?
Our voices should be louder. Our voices are and should be continuing to be coordinated, and we should not accept for a moment the status quo that we have right now. And we should not make our allies get used to the status quo. That means talking daily about Abkhazia, about Crimea, about Eastern Ukraine, about Tzhinval. That means not forgetting about these issues for one day or moment. It's important to note that does not mean that we don't develop. Georgia has not stopped its development in European and Euro-Atlantic direction, even after occupation. But that means also talking about those problems daily. So it's a very tough task. We have to develop and strengthen and develop our societies on one hand, and we have to speak about our problems on the other hand. Doing this together is problematic, but that's what we have to do, and that's how we'll overcome the situation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.